Hello there, and welcome to this week's episode of AB Plus. Thank you so much for joining us and for joining us the previous few weeks and months. It's really appreciated, and some of the questions that you've sent in have been great. And tonight we're going to be answering some of those questions on the Eighth Commandment. And just at the start, as always, I want to remind you, please do send in those questions on the 9th and the 10th Commandment that's coming up in the next few weeks. We would really love to try and answer those for you as we go through them and discuss them. The mobile number should be, of course, on the screen or accompanying the video as always. And this week we have two new guests, which I'm sure there's plenty of people in Rathfriland will recognise both of them. And I suppose before I go any further, I'll just ask you gentlemen to introduce yourselves.
Andrew Conway is my name. I'm the minister in Hilltown and Clonduff. I'm married to Sarah Jane with two youngsters, Annie and Peter, aged 7 and 4.
And the man from Kilkeel, that's me, Jackie Blue. I'm a member of Mourne Presbyterian Church. I serve there as an elder. I'm also an accredited preacher, and I was a Bible class leader there for 20 odd years. So I probably taught Mark, I'm not too sure, I can't remember now, but probably yes. Yep. I'm married to Anne. We have 3 grown-up children and 8 grandchildren. I'm a former officer in the Danish Merchant Navy. I was there for some 30 years, followed by 10 plus years in the RUC/PSNI, the most of it which I spent plodding the streets and the hills of Rathfriland.
So the commandment very simply says, you shall not steal. Then if we move forward to Amos, chapter 8 and verse 4, starting at verse 4. Hear this, you who trample on the needy and bring the poor of the land to an end, saying, when will the new moon be over that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath that we may offer wheat for sale, that we may make the epith small and the shekel great, and deal deceitfully with false balances, that we may buy the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, and sell the chaff of the wheat. Then Malachi, chapter 3, verse 8. Will man rob God? Yet you are robbing me. But you say, how have you robbed? How have we robbed you? In your tithes and contributions. You are cursed with a curse, for you are robbing me, the whole nation of you. Bring the full tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house, and thereby put me to the test, says the Lord of hosts. If I will not open the windows of heaven for you, and pour down for you blessings, until there is no more need. Then Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 28. Let the thief no longer steal, but rather let him labor, doing honest work with his own hands, so that he may have something to share with anyone in need. Then Mark chapter 12 verse 17. Jesus said to them, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And they marveled at him. And then finally, John chapter 10 and verse 10. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. So with those in mind, we'll move on to our questions. And the first question is this. Many people think they have kept this commandment. In what ways can we break this commandment without realizing?
To buy something, maybe we're going on holiday, so we have a little list and we'll go looking for maybe designer t-shirts. We want to look smart on the beach. DVDs, expensive things like Nike running shoes, or maybe Ray-Ban sunglasses. But when we're there, and most of us would have a fair, decent idea that these things are quite expensive. Ray-Ban, maybe you can get them in the airport at maybe 60 or 70 pounds, but you might notice on this that they're quite cheap, maybe 25 pounds. So if the alarm bells don't ring and let you tell you that these are probably pirated or counterfeit goods. And such goods are, of course, illegal, and low prices indeed should sound the alarm bells for us. But if we continue with such a purchase, we're then aiding and abetting the counterfeiters who will continue to steal taxes from the government. And in purchasing these goods, we're also helping put genuine retailers out of business. Or even going further, we might download music on our smartphones, iPlayers, not giving any thought to the fact that, yeah, I probably have to pay for this. We might even lift the phone in work and call a friend. Certainly that's also, unless you have permission, that's theft. You might be tempted to spread unsavory gossip about someone who we don't particularly like. And in so doing, we're literally stealing their reputation. I'm sure there's much more to that.
But just building on what you're mentioning here, and I hadn't thought about it until you raised it, Jackie, about the clothing industry. I was just listening to a piece on the news today about how these different high street names like Topshop, etc., have been bought over by online businesses. And I think it's Boohoo, and they said that by the 1st of March or 1st of April, they want all their manufacturing to be brought in-house because they're conscious about the risk of it being manufactured in this child labour market, or people are not being paid enough a fair day's pay for their work. Yeah. So if we've arranged to meet with people and say we've arranged a meeting and the people coming to the meeting continuously turn up late, that is stealing. If tonight we've set for a certain time, we've all turned up on time, but so often we're involved in meetings and people dander in whenever it suits them, and a one-off, you'll accept their apology, but whenever they do it time after time, then that, in a sense, is stealing.
Absolutely.
True. Go ahead, Andrew.
So I think it's a very striking example of the way in which the 10 Commandments function to expose our sin, because I think our natural reaction, I think, for most people is to look at the 8th Commandment and you think, oh well, I'm definitely okay in that one, because you automatically tend to interpret it in a very restrictive kind of way, where you think, well, I've never got in to the bank with a mask over my head and held the clerk at gunpoint and made out with a bag of cash. So obviously I haven't broken that one, but when you stop to think about it a bit more at what Jack and Trevor said of various examples, and I think you could run for a long, long time and still not exhaust all the examples. It's one of those, if you pay it lip service, you'll sort of think, I'm probably all right. But if you stop and think about what it must mean from God's point of view, as best as we can grasp that, then all of a sudden you realize, my goodness, not only is it possible to break this, but I have broken this more times than I realize, and in more ways than I can count.
Yeah, that's right.
More times since I became a Christian, never mind, but before I became one.
I think it's one of those as well that we would find it a lot easier to see if people were stealing from other people or from us than see ourselves stealing from them. I know something that actually came to mind, which I suppose is actually quite funny in some ways when we think about it, that it feels an awful lot like stealing when you go into a supermarket now and you buy a chicken and you put it into the oven, and by the time you take it out of the oven, it's half the size, because it's not full of water. And, that is a form of stealing as well, So maybe a funny example, but it's the truth. And then if you look at the packaging of many things, you'll see the net weight and the gross weight, and people don't ever actually think to look at that. So it's interesting, I think.
Mark, you sound a wee bit like my wife. My wife, of course, has a better excuse than you, because she was born in Scotland, She's always of the opinion that she's shortchanged every time she goes shopping.
Well, with that, before you go any deeper when you get into trouble, we'll move on to the second question. It's a bit of a tougher one maybe to understand, or to answer. Question 2: can we steal from God, and if so, how?
Well, the passage that you read from Malachi does draw some pointers to that. Will man rob God?
Yeah.
And yes, and we might say, but how have we robbed you? And this is a thing that comes up very often in certainly in Mourne. Tithing. Some will say, tithing. No, that was the Old Testament stuff, wasn't it? We just give now what we think is about the right amount. But that command has never changed. It's still 10% or more than that if you can. And that is, if we all were tithing, even if we only had, if it amounted only to a few pounds, if we all who attended church tithed, all the churches would be able to do lots and lots of things and broadcast and proclaim the gospel and send people all over the place to let them know about the love of Christ. But we're starving. Our churches are being starved simply because we feel we have, just by being in church, that's me, I've done my duty. But we owe God, and I think I don't expect I can just turn to it in the scriptures just now, but we owe God the first portion of our pay. And when we do not give God his due, we are robbing him, literally. I think in what is it we say? The Bible confirms that the eternal God is the creator of everything that exists. He is actually the owner of the entire universe. And Psalm 24 verse 1 reminds us that the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness, the world and those who dwell therein. And so Malachi says, chapter 3 says that we rob God. We rob God when we are not faithful in our giving.
Okay. And it goes back to other commandments, Mark. If we're not giving to God, well, then we're not putting God first. We're worshiping something. We're worshiping money rather than worshiping God. We're stealing, and we're coveting. We're coveting things for ourselves that aren't ours. And we're not truly trusting that God is able to provide for us. Therefore, we don't feel able to give back what he has asked us to give. But not only are we stealing our money, and I take up Andrew's point too, since I've been studying these 10 commandments, one of the things I've learned is just the depth of sinfulness relating to my own life, because you start off thinking that you're stacking up okay, and once you dig into these commandments, you just see sin after sin, guilt after guilt. So we've got the money issue. We're stealing from God by not worshiping. We're stealing from God by not being willing to give of our time and our talents to serve him and to work for his kingdom. We're stealing from God in how we neglect the keeping and the honouring of the Lord's day. So those are a couple of areas that I would just add into the mix as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. You probably think maybe the minister's going to speak on the Eighth Commandment in the morning. Well, I don't need to go because that doesn't apply to me.
Yeah.
It's a far-reaching commandment.
Yeah.
It's a broad commandment. It covers every aspect of our lives. Really, it truly does. Yeah. It's only when you don't sit down and think about it. Absolutely everything. You can hardly get to your car that you haven't actually just committed something wrong with that commandment has just hit you. Very fact that you're going with your keys. Why am I going with my keys? Because I have to lock the house up, because when I'm away, somebody may come in and take something. We live in that. We live in that environment today. We really do. My phone is dingling here, but it's nothing. I'll take it away.
I think another element in relation to the question, Mark, is that all sins sin against God, and so a person steals from another person in whatever way, direct or indirect, we might be inclined to think of that as an offense against another person first and foremost. And it is an offense against another person, but if anything, primarily it's an offense against God. And I always think it's very striking, Psalm 51, that David prays, against you only have I sinned. And the only, in a sense, is an overstatement of the point, because he obviously had sinned against Uriah, Bathsheba, and all of Israel in a sense, but
Yes.
yet he had this firm sense that his sin was primarily against God, and that's it. Can you steal against God, or steal from God? Certainly in all the ways that have been mentioned, but also anytime you steal, you're sinning against God.
Yeah,
That's true. Absolutely. Absolutely. I remember as a child being told, by my mum, I suppose it was the simplest way she could say it to me, remember, God is watching.
Yeah.
And so I was always conscious, I sometimes would have looked around, see if there any movement in the room or something like that. But it really did it describe to me, that no matter what you do, yes, we might, just like you say, Andrew, you sin against a person, and we all do that at some stage in life. But ultimately and primarily, we're sinning against God, because we're all made in the image of God.
Our third question is a wee bit, I'm struggling to get my head around it away, but question 3 is this: can a person be guilty of stealing from themselves?
And the couple of brief things that I have noted are that we can steal rest from ourselves. Again, going back to the point, we think we have to work harder to make more money, and we don't want to give that money away to God, or we don't want to give too much of it to God because we need it all for ourselves. So we can actually steal rest because we're working harder than we actually have to. We're not taking time to worship, so we're stealing both rest and contentment, and spending time in the presence of God, and we're often stealing happiness from ourselves. So that was the line I was taking, just as an opener for Andrew.
It's funny, do you know what? In some ways, I would love to be asked that question in a one-to-one conversation by the person who thought it up, because it'd be really interesting to explore just what exactly they have in mind. But I think in terms of the from Matthew 16 and repeated elsewhere in the Gospels, where Jesus says, if you want to keep your life, you'll lose it. If you lose your life for me, you'll find it. So I think there's a sense in which when you steal from God, you are actually ultimately stealing from yourself, because the best thing you can do with your life is give it to the Master and walk in his way. And in not doing that, you might think you're keeping something for yourself, but in fact, you're really stealing from yourself.
Yeah, and just I know, Andrew, you're keeping us focused on the shorter catechism, but in the Heidelberg Catechism, whenever it comes to talk about the Eighth Commandment, it talks about deceptive merchandise, as we've discussed, counterfeit money, defrauding our neighbour, and schemes and devices that deceive other people. Well, in a sense, we're stealing from ourselves whenever we deceive ourselves that we can save ourselves. We're denying ourselves the joy of the salvation of Jesus Christ.
That's right. Yeah.
So we're stealing in that way as well.
Yeah.
So Heidelberg was actually, quite broad and comprehensive on the Eighth Commandment.
Yes. I was thinking of my time in the RUC. There was, I think, I wasn't working with CID, you can imagine. I mean, I'd worked all my years in the Merchant Navy, and then I went back to the police. I was simply in the reserve, but because I was in Rathfriland, you were called in to do just what everybody else was doing, and you got caught up sometimes in listening to to folks dealing with something. And there was a case I remember where someone actually, I think, was prosecuted for stealing from themselves, but it was,
Okay.
there are some extremely clever and devious people out there who are experts at finding loopholes in the law, especially in the world of finance. And I think that this was, in my mind, it was something like somebody who actually stole from a business he owned, and he wrote off the theft, as it were, like as a business loss, and didn't report the stolen value as personal income. But when it was all investigated, they discovered that he was arrested and charged for tax fraud. So he did initially steal from himself, but of course had to pay the piper as a result of that, you know.
Question 4, I'm looking forward to this one in a way, is simply, is it always wrong to steal? Now, in the preparation for this, I sent you a wee note that said about the recent news story concerning the GameStop prices in the stock market. And I'm not sure if you had the chance to look at that or not, but I thought it was very interesting because basically people with an awful lot of money who would be seen as, you know, the big bad crooks of the world lost, I think it was nearly, some reports were saying $26 billion. A lot of people went out of business, and there was a few people, well, an awful lot of people seemed to lose their jobs over it. And that was all because pretty much one little fella decided that he was going to get his own back. He was obviously very smart and knew how to do it. And that's seen as a win for the little man. It's what I would describe as a Robin Hood kind of story. You know, you're stealing from the rich and you're giving to the poor. And so when people see those kind of stories and they hear that kind of thing, they'll think, yes, this is a victory for the little man, for the middleman or whatever. So on the back of that, do you think, is it always wrong to steal?
Well, the Bible says thou shalt not steal, or you should not steal. It can't be made more simple, I think. You shall not steal. There's no ifs, no buts, and there's no, maybe under certain circumstances or certain conditions, stealing should always be considered to be immoral, even if done for the well-being of others. And I don't think we could ever do that. A classic example, I think, and then we touched on it in question 2, possibly, and I don't know if we did touch on it, but I had mentioned some, or had written down something for that. It's stealing to feed a starving family, for example. But the Bible still says you shall not steal. And so stealing is legally and ethically wrong. Indeed, it's always wrong to steal. But, and then we come with this, but if children are starving, might it perhaps be morally justified? And no doubt Satan would say, yeah, absolutely. Satan may try to convince us that it is justified when there's children involved. That so we may have to resort to a little bit of dishonesty in order to take care of the children. But it's a lie. And it's a lie from the father of liars. Remember, way back, I think it was in Mark Gospel, how Satan urged Jesus to turn the stones into bread. He was really, at that time, he was suggesting that his father wouldn't take care of him. But we know, of course, different, and Jesus knew different. Naturally, Satan was lying. Jesus, of course, trusted his father and found him to be faithful. And it's the same with us. We don't have to resort to dishonesty to gain what we need for our well-being. Stealing is always wrong.
Yeah, and of course, even when you think of Robin Hood, his other name is the Prince of Thieves. So even when he was doing what he was doing and he was given to the poor, he was still called a thief at the end of the day. So he's
Yes, yeah.
I think there's and I mean, that's not the only situation where this applies. I think there's a temptation sometimes to, what would you say, maybe get fixated with questions that aren't actually likely to arise in our own situation. You know, so the other one I think is when you come to the ninth commandment about bearing false testimony, and questions raised, sometimes referring to Rahab, sent the spies off in the opposite direction.
Yeah.
Or Corrie ten Boom, what would you do if you had Jews in your attic and the Nazis came to the door? And I find those questions very interesting, but at the same time, the Nazis aren't going to come to my door tonight. And, you know, so that there can be a temptation to think, well, you know, if you actually were starving, if there wasn't any food on the table at all, maybe it would be better to steal and let your children die. And I think we can all at least see
That's true.
somebody who's saying that's coming from, but at the same time, we're not in that situation. You know,
No.
there's a temptation maybe to get fixated with those sort of problems and almost use that as an excuse for taking a laissez-faire approach to the whole thing. You know, you sort of introduce grey areas to hide the fact that, you know, actually you're doing things you shouldn't be doing.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
It's the same too, I suppose, and the governmental sort of paying your taxes as well. People say the tax avoidance or evasion is justified because, you know, for whatever reason they've taken more money than they should have at another time or whatever. So it is actually, it does apply to us here as well. That, you know, there are a lot of people out there that would quite happily save a couple of pounds on their taxes, on their tax return. Our fifth question then, which is our last question, and it's a little bit more wordy than the rest. How does the Eighth Commandment serve as a guide for our personal relationships, as well as how we treat people in general?
Well, I think whenever it comes to our neighbour, this commandment asks us to promote our neighbour's good whenever we can, and to think honestly and uprightly of them, and not to do anything to, you know, shortchange them. And I suppose coming out of that, if we do good to our neighbour, then we're reflecting that God has been good to us, and God wants us to be generous of spirit rather than selfish or greedy. So I would chip that in for starters.
Sure.
But Trevor more or less invited me to talk about the shorter catechism earlier, so I might as well do so. And I think one of the really helpful things in that section on the commandments is that you, at the beginning, you have that description that the moral law is love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, all your strength. Love your neighbour as yourselves. And then the Catechism goes on to say that the Ten Commandments is effectively an outworking of that. And I think if you see thou shalt not steal as one element of the outworking of love your neighbour as yourself, then you can see that it has definite relevance in all situations, and it's about how you do your tax return. It's about how you do your work, how you treat your colleagues, your customers, the people that you buy from, and to that end, it's going to have relevance as long as people are engaging in any kind of commercial activity with each other, and even wider than that.
That's right, yes. Well, when we think that the Bible confirms, and I said it earlier, that the eternal God is the creator of everything that exists. He's actually the owner of the entire universe, and I quoted Psalm 24 about that. But he is indeed the owner of all things, because he is the creator of all things. So when we violate our bodies, for example, or those of others, say our neighbors or our friends, or indeed any member of our family, or we are taking something away that belongs to God. You know, I think we went through the whole thing of recently, maybe not just so recently, about smacking children, and in real terms. And I suppose when I was a young child in my young years, and I lived on a farm, and I was a bit wild, and I would admit, and I would have got what my father called the Sally rod. That was a little long, thin bit of the willow tree that grows, and if you get a whack up on the leg, you remember it for days. In fact, I can remember it for 60-odd years. So no parent can say, I'm going to smack my child whenever I want, because the child does not belong to the parent as a possession. It's not a thing he has. It's not like a bicycle or a car. Or he's a human being. He's a child of God, and he's born and created in the image of God. And on the other hand, Scripture does teach that God gives us resources and objects and property as a stewardship. And so it is possible that someone out there is going to come and try and take it away from me or from any of us if we have stuff. And the sin of theft, of course, is wrong, and not just because the victim, if we're stolen from or broken into, we are hurt, but because God's order of all things is violated. And the Eighth Commandment, which states that thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, applies to all of our personal relationships, our interpersonal relationships with our neighbor, with our friend, with the person we sit beside in church or in the choir or wherever. And stealing counteracts, it really does counteract the building of a strong and healthy and God-honoring community.
Well, unless anybody has anything more to add on that, I think we're more or less out of time. So I suppose all that's left to do is say thank you very much. Thank you to Jackie. Thank you to Andrew for coming along. There's a lot of wise words and an awful lot to think there. Again, this is one of the commandments that we've looked at and we've thought each time, I suppose, as I've looked at them at the start, I think, how are we going to get questions out of this? How are we going to get answers out of this? But there's always so much more than we ever think. And this one in particular, as I say, so many people think they don't break it, but of course we all do. But just as a wrap up, thanks again, Jackie. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Trevor, as always. And just to those at home, again, if you have any questions, please do send them in on the 9th and 10th commandment. It's not too long, 2 more shows to go, and then we'll be all wrapped up. So if you've any questions, please send them in to the number that will be on screen. So thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Cheerio.